Your neighbor understands your dog's day better than you do, not because they spend more time with your dog, but because they hear what happens after you leave. They hear when the whining begins. They hear how long the scratching at the door lasts. They notice which afternoons are the loudest. Things you never notice, because when those moments happen, you're somewhere else. And while you're gone, your dog is living a part of their life that you never get to see. And then you come home. The door opens, and your dog looks completely normal. Maybe they wag their tail. Maybe they bounce around a little, happy to see you. From their point of view, nothing unusual just happened. But you've noticed small clues around the house. A sofa cushion on the floor, the corner of the rug bent up in a way it definitely wasn't this morning. And sometimes there's that strange quiet, the kind where your dog seems to be watching you carefully, like the mood in the room has shifted. Most people explain it away. Maybe the dog was bored, maybe it got a little mischievous, maybe it just had a weird day. But for years, behavioral researchers have been doing something most owners never think to do. They set up a camera, leave the house, and simply watch what happens. And what those cameras record, minute by minute, is surprisingly revealing. Because when you're gone, your dog isn't just missing you. Something very specific begins happening in its brain, and it actually starts before you've even closed the door. Back in 2010, a group of researchers at the University of Milan decided to find out what actually happens after owners walk out the door. They set up cameras in the homes of 23 dogs, and then simply left. What the cameras recorded was surprisingly consistent. On average, it took about 3 minutes and 15 seconds after the owner left for the first sounds to begin. Barking, whining, sometimes howling, the kind of noise your neighbors might hear through the wall but you never do. Then the behavior escalated. Within 7 minutes, many dogs started turning their attention to the house itself. Shoes became targets. Furniture legs, door frames, anything nearby. 7 minutes. That's roughly how long it takes before your belongings are officially at risk. But the most interesting part wasn't the chaos at the beginning, because after a while, the frantic phase begins to fade. The barking slows down, the scratching at the door stops, the house becomes quiet again. And if you happen to walk back in during that quiet moment, you'd probably think everything was fine. No noise, no obvious damage, just a dog sitting there, looking normal. From the outside, it would look like your dog had finally calmed down. But according to the cameras, that's not what actually happened. But the story doesn't actually end when the noise stops. When researchers looked more closely at the footage, something interesting started to appear. Yes, the barking faded. The scratching at the door slowed down, the house became quieter. But the dog itself wasn't really calmer. In fact, the opposite was happening. As the vocalization decreased, the panting increased. You could see it clearly on camera, the dog pacing the room, tongue out, breathing faster than normal. And when researchers measured heart rate, it was still elevated long after the barking had stopped. In other words, the dog hadn't relaxed at all. It had simply switched from one kind of distress to another. The noise was gone, but the stress in the body was still very much there. Then researchers noticed something even more revealing once they started tracking behavior over longer periods of time. The stress didn't just fade away slowly. It didn't follow a smooth decline the way you might expect. Instead, it moved in cycles. Roughly every 23 to 28 minutes, something would change. The dog would suddenly become active again. Maybe it would start pacing the room. Maybe it would bark again. Sometimes it would return to the door and scratch or whine for a moment. Then the energy would drop again. The room would go quiet, but not for long. After another 20 minutes or so, the pattern would repeat. Another burst of movement, another short wave of noise, then silence again. From the outside, those quiet moments might look like the dog has finally settled down. But the cameras show a different story. The dog isn't settling. It's cycling. And that silence between the spikes isn't peace. It's just the pause before the next wave of stress. And once you see that pattern on camera, the next question becomes obvious. Is this what every dog does when it's left alone? Or is something different happening in dogs that don't struggle with separation? To answer that, researchers looked at a second group. This time, the study came out of Sweden, from the University of Agricultural Sciences. The setup was simple. Dogs were left alone at home, sometimes for as long as 4 hours, while cameras quietly recorded what happened. What those cameras captured looked completely different. Most of these dogs spent almost the entire time doing very little. About 97% of their time was passive. They lay down on the floor, curled up on the couch, rested. Occasionally, they'd stand up, wander over to the water bowl, take a drink, maybe glance toward the door for a second, then they'd lie down again. No frantic pacing, no repeated bursts of barking, no cycles of panic, just quiet waiting. And that's an important distinction. These dogs weren't distressed, but they weren't bored either. They weren't searching for something to do, chewing furniture out of frustration, or reacting to every sound in the hallway. They were simply waiting for their person to come back, which raises a really interesting point, because when researchers compared these two groups of dogs, the difference didn't line up with the things people usually assume. It wasn't about breed. It wasn't about age. And surprisingly, it wasn't even strongly tied to genetics. Instead, the research kept pointing to one factor that mattered more than almost anything else. Not who the dog is, but what the dog has learned to expect when you walk out the door. And that idea, what a dog has learned to expect, leads to something most owners completely miss, because the real reaction doesn't necessarily begin when you walk out the door. In many cases, it starts well before that. Veterinary behaviorists began noticing this decades ago. Back in the 1980s, researchers Nicholas Borchelt and Lynette Voith documented a pattern that has been confirmed again and again in later studies. Dogs that struggle with separation anxiety often start showing signs of stress while their owner is still in the house, not after the door closes, before it even happens. The reason is surprisingly simple. Dogs are extremely good at recognizing patterns. Over time, they learn the sequence of your morning routine almost like a chain of signals. You check your phone, you put on your shoes, maybe you glance at the clock or grab your bag. None of those actions seem important on their own, but to a dog who has watched the same routine play out hundreds of times, they mean something very specific. They mean you're about to leave. And once that association forms, the reaction can begin long before you reach the door. Some dogs start panting. Others begin pacing around the room. Some will follow you everywhere you go, trailing behind you from the kitchen to the hallway to the living room, as if they're trying to stay close for as long as possible. If you watch closely, you can almost see the moment they realize what's coming. They've seen this pattern before. They know how it ends. And there's something quietly heartbreaking about that moment. Because while you're just finishing your routine and heading out the door, your dog may already be bracing for the next few hours, watching you move from room to room, hoping even if they can't quite understand why that maybe this time the pattern will break, that maybe this time you'll stay. And that moment, the one where your dog watches you walk out the door, is exactly what decades of research have been trying to understand. Because once cameras started quietly recording what happens after people leave, a much clearer picture began to emerge. For more than 30 years now, those cameras have shown something surprisingly consistent. Some dogs simply settle down and wait. They lie on the couch, stretch out on the floor, maybe wander to the window for a moment. Time passes, and eventually their person comes back. For them, the absence is just a quiet pause in the day. But other dogs experience something very different. Instead of settling, they move through waves of distress. Every 20 minutes or so, the pattern repeats. A burst of pacing, a few barks, maybe scratching at the door or circling the room. Then things go quiet again for a while, until the next wave arrives. From the outside, those quiet periods can look reassuring. A silent house, a dog lying still. It seems like everything has calmed down. But that silence isn't always peace. What's important to understand is that the dog isn't reacting to something you did wrong that morning. It isn't about the toy you forgot to leave out or a puzzle feeder that ran out of treats too quickly. In fact, most dogs aren't connecting their stress to any specific action you took at all. What they're reacting to is something much deeper. The absence of a nervous system they've grown used to regulating themselves around yours. Over months and years of living together, your dog's internal stress system slowly adjusts to yours. Your daily rhythms, your voice, even your stress levels become part of the environment their brain learns to read. Researchers have even found that long-term stress hormones in dogs often mirror those of their owners. So when you leave, it isn't just a person disappearing from the room. For some dogs, it's the sudden removal of the system their own nervous system has learned to balance against. And the dogs that struggle the most aren't stubborn, badly trained, or trying to misbehave. In many cases, they simply haven't learned at a deep physiological level that the moment you leave and the moment you return are actually part of the same pattern. The door closes, and eventually, the same door opens again.